Before a single frame could flicker into motion, the physical reality of cinema in 1930 was defined by the mechanical hum of heavy machinery and the thick haze of arc lamp smoke. Outside the theater walls, the streets of late Weimar-era Berlin reflected a society caught in a tense, chaotic interlude between the devastation of the First World War and an impending political collapse. At the center of this cultural powder keg sat the UFA Studios, Germany's industrial film engine and the creative hub for Europe's most ambitious visual storytelling. For over a decade, directors here had mastered the silent image, but the arrival of synchronized sound, the talkie, forced a complete disruption of the visual grammar they had spent years perfecting. The immediate reality of early sound recording was deeply restrictive. Directors were suddenly tethered to heavy, immobile electronic equipment and fragile vacuum tubes, forcing dynamic cameras into static, soundproof boxes. It was into this rigid environment of technological constraint that director Joseph von Sternberg arrived. Sternberg recognized synchronized sound as a new mechanical tool to engineer psychological realism, looking past the industry's initial obsession with simple recorded dialogue. To understand his approach, we have to look at the visual legacy he was inheriting. German Expressionism relied heavily on stark, exaggerated shadows and distorted sets to convey deep emotional states entirely without words. Against this stood the emerging demand of the sound era, gritty realism. Audiences hearing authentic voices now expected a more lived-in, physically authentic representation of the world on screen. Sternberg's definitive case study for merging these two opposing cinematic philosophies was The Blue Angel, or Der Blaue Engel. He grounds this experiment in the character of Professor Emanuel Rath, a man who acts as the human embodiment of the old, rigid order. Rath is a man of extreme discipline, which leaves him entirely vulnerable to a rapidly modernizing, chaotic world. His tragic arc is inevitable the moment he steps outside his routine. The catalyst for his psychological trauma arrives through a specific character archetype that Sternberg develops here, the femme fatale. By weaponizing spatial contrasts and auditory isolation to map Rath's internal decay, Sternberg established the technical framework for an archetype that would come to define the sound era. We first observe Rath in his natural environment, the stifling, gray world of the academic classroom, which establishes his psychological baseline. The geometric precision of this space is deliberate. The straight lines and heavy wooden desks represent a fortress of pure intellect, governed by strict, unbreakable rules. This animated rendering illustrates Sternberg's precise use of chiaroscuro lighting. By angling the light, he casts stark, vertical shadows across the environment. Notice how these static shadow bars visually signify absolute, repressed discipline. There is no room for spatial freedom. To maintain this academic fortress, Rath requires profound silence and sterile, predictable order. Sternberg establishes this extreme, rigid baseline early on to guarantee that any subsequent sensory disruption will feel deeply jarring to the audience. It reveals that Rath's ordered existence is highly brittle. He has built a structure completely unprepared to survive an environment of sensory overload. That overload begins at the threshold of the Blue Angel Club. Stepping through these doors marks the physical and psychological boundary between order and chaos. Once inside, the visual language instantly shifts. The clean lines of the academy are replaced by a cluttered, densely packed, and highly lived-in aesthetic. Sternberg abandons the sharp edges of the classroom, leaning heavily into soft-focus cinematography to blur the boundaries of the room. He utilizes heavy visual textures, dense plumes of tobacco smoke and heavy velvet curtains catching warm amber light, to engineer an almost suffocating, humid atmosphere. This intense visual friction is the precise mechanism that begins chipping away at Rath's psychological defenses. Into this chaotic space steps Marlene Dietrich as the cabaret singer, Lola Lola. Sternberg does not frame her as a traditional, plotting villain. Instead, she is presented as a carefully composed visual element, entirely natural within the clutter. Dietrich's performance archetype is built on a specific kind of nonchalance. She projects a cynical magnetism, carrying herself with a heavy, almost bored posture. She does not actively orchestrate Rath's demise. She functions as an indifferent mirror, merely reflecting his own internal decay back at him. It is the sheer environmental chaos, paired with Lola's unbothered indifference, that dismantles the professor's rigid mind. This dismantling reaches its climax as Rath falls from a respected academic to a frayed, humiliated stage clown, forced to perform in the very cabaret that ruined him. To mirror this collapse, Sternberg shifts the lighting temperature. The warm, seductive gold of the cabaret floor turns into a cold, unforgiving gray backstage. Looking at this top-down diagram of the dressing room, shadows fragment. A single light source breaks over jagged obstacles, creating distorted, overlapping patterns, representing a shattered psyche. Simultaneously, the narrowed field of view deliberately boxes the character in, inducing spatial claustrophobia. But the visual trap is only half the equation. Sternberg then introduces the final, auditory element of Rath's isolation. Sternberg ignores the standard drive for exposition, instead deploying sound as a harsh structural punctuation to the visual claustrophobia. While Rath breaks down in the cramped dressing room, the distinct, isolated sound of Lola's laughter echoes from the stage above him. Because the space is so tight, that single audio cue becomes inescapable. The laughter acts as a weapon, cementing his absolute failure and sealing his internal trauma. In these moments, Sternberg demonstrated that the talkie's true power lay in its ability to engineer deep psychological terror through sensory immersion. The core achievement of The Blue Angel lies in its uncompromising execution. It simply refuses to look away from the ugly reality of human degradation. This combination of spatial claustrophobia and weaponized audio forces the audience into a state of complicity with Rath's humiliation. It is a dark, mechanical formula, but it built a lasting cinematic legacy. The deliberate contrast between the frantic, ruined man and the composed, indifferent woman established the enduring visual power of the femme fatale archetype. This dynamic instantly cemented the creative partnership between Sternberg and Dietrich, a director-muse relationship that would shape Hollywood film noir for decades. Yet, the film's impact is equally tied to its specific moment in history. Lola's cynical spirit captured the exhausted, fatalistic mood of 1930s Berlin with precision, reflecting a society on the brink of collapse. It stands as a dark cultural monument, recorded right before the socio-political collapse of the Weimar Republic. Beyond the technology and the history, the film remains highly effective today because of what it demonstrates: the extreme fragility of human dignity when subjected to the precise mechanical power of the cinematic image. This was brought to you by Stalls or Circle. Thank you for listening.